radio static cut through the silence like a blade. We were sent on a patrol, but never came back the same. It was 1993, deep in the combat zone of Mindanao. I was stationed at Forward Operating Base Delta when our radio technician, Sergeant Cruz, picked up something that shouldn't have existed. The transmission came through on an old frequency, Morse code, desperate and repeating, "Help me! Help me!" Cruz's hands trembled as he adjusted the dials. The voiceover crackled with interference, but the coordinates were clear. Grid reference 14°36 north, 121 degrees 2 east. A rice field near the jungle perimeter, enemy territory we'd swept just last week. "Sir, this transmission, it's coming from 1944. I thought I was losing my mind when I saw the radar screen. The blip showed a date stamp that made no sense. The whispers in the static grew louder, mixing with what sounded like propeller engines. No aircraft were scheduled for that sector. The fog moved like it was alive outside our bunker windows. Radio silence should have been maintained. But something was calling to us from coordinates sent from HQ decades ago. The paranormal encounter hadn't even begun, yet every instinct told me we were walking into a supernatural force. Cruz looked up from his equipment, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold mountain air. "The signal's getting stronger, Major. Whatever's out there, it knows we're listening." The jungle went silent. No birds, no insects, just that haunting Morse code repeating endlessly. I grabbed my gear and checked the extraction point coordinates. Something told me this mission briefing was about to change everything we thought we knew about war. We reached the rice field at 0400 hours. The fog that shouldn't have been there clung to the ground like smoke from a battlefield. My recon mission had turned into something else entirely. There, half buried in the mud, sat a World War II bomber. "Jesus Christ," whispered Corporal Santos, our youngest soldier. "That wasn't here yesterday." The aircraft looked fresh, too fresh for something lost in 1944. The metal gleamed despite decades of supposed jungle rot. Symbols carved into trees surrounded the crash site, markings I'd never seen in any military manual. The locals swore this field was empty when they worked it the day before. I approached the cockpit, my boots crunching in frost that had no business existing in tropical heat. Inside, I could see the crew, decomposed bodies in period uniforms, dog tags still hanging from skeletal necks. But their equipment looked operational, as if they'd just landed. "Requesting evac, there's something in the trees," Santos radioed, but only static answered. The evil entity watching us wasn't visible, but I felt it. War trauma teaches you to recognize when you're being hunted. The hallucination or reality question plagued every step I took toward that bomber. Voices in my head whispered coordinates, locations, mission details I'd never been briefed on. A child's laughter echoed from the tree line. Impossible in this combat zone. The haunted village stories the locals told suddenly felt real. As I reached for the bomber's door handle, the radio crackled with a transmission that made my blood freeze. "Fox Squadron to base, we're going down. Repeat, we're going down." The voice was my own. They pulled me off active duty the next morning. Major Carlos Reyes, half American, half Filipino, with classified access I could only dream of, arrived by helicopter before sunrise. I knew his reputation. The man who investigated things the Pentagon wanted to forget. Reyes looked haunted, carrying secrets behind those dark eyes. When he examined the crash site, his face went pale. He found something in that bomber, a photograph that made him pocket it quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "This part wasn't in the mission briefing," he muttered, studying the wreckage with the intensity of someone who'd seen this before. The possession of information came naturally to him. While my unit maintained perimeter security, Reyes conducted his own paranormal encounter with the evidence. He spoke to the aircraft like it could hear him, whispering questions in 2 languages. "Sir, the compass isn't working," reported one of his men. Reyes just nodded, as if malfunctioning equipment was expected. He pulled out a tape recorder, rewinding something he'd been listening to privately. The fog moved around him differently, parting as he walked. I caught a glimpse of the photograph before he secured it. A World War II pilot who looked exactly like Reyes, down to the same haunted expression. The guilt followed us home that day, but for him, it seemed like the guilt had been following him much longer. The unnatural presence in that rice field had found its investigator, and somehow, I knew this was personal. Reyes recovered more than photographs from that bomber. Hidden in the cockpit was a leather-bound diary, pages yellow with age, but readable. The entries began normal, routine mission logs from 1944. Then they turned strange. October 12, 1944. Black clouds appeared from nowhere, compass spinning. Lost radio contact with base for 3 hours, but somehow we kept flying. I read over his shoulder as he turned each page. The handwriting grew more erratic with each entry, describing Japanese voices on empty radio channels, and time that moved backwards during flight. The supernatural force the crew encountered wasn't foreign. It was the same presence I'd felt in that rice field. October 15, 1944. Thompson says he saw ground crew that weren't there. I thought I was losing my mind until Williams saw them too. They wore no uniforms. They had no faces. Reyes hid certain pages from my view, but I caught fragments. References to the experiment, coordinates that matched our current location, and mission orders signed by someone with the surname Reyes. The final entry was written in blood. The sky forgot us. We're flying in circles. The radio won't stop talking, but no one's speaking. Permission to enter. Permission to enter. But enter what? Whispers in the static filled our command bunker as Reyes closed the diary. The voices in my head that had started at the crash site grew louder, mixing English with Japanese, present with past. "Major," I said carefully, "that pilot in the photograph." He looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge. "Lieutenant Marcus Reed, my grandfather." The war trauma suddenly made sense. This wasn't just another paranormal encounter. It was a family haunting that had waited decades to surface. The locals knew more than they'd initially admitted. When Reyes interviewed them with a translator, their stories painted a picture that defied military logic. "Before the plane appeared," said old Maria Santos, "we saw soldiers walking in the field, American uniforms from the old war. They moved like they were marching, but their feet didn't touch the ground." Her grandson, barely 8 years old, claimed he'd spoken to one of them. "The pilot asked me where he was. I told him Mindanao, but he said that was impossible. He said they were supposed to be over the Pacific." Each testimony added another layer to the haunted village mystery. The cursed land had been showing signs for weeks. Animals avoiding the rice field, electronics malfunctioning, and most disturbing, boot prints that appeared overnight in perfect formation. "They were searching for something," Maria continued. "Every night for a week, we heard them calling coordinates, the same numbers, over and over." Reyes recorded everything, but I could see the psychological horror building behind his professional demeanor. The guilt that followed us home was nothing compared to what he was carrying. When the translator finished, he pulled me aside. "My father was stationed here in 1944, he whispered. "Part of a special forces unit running classified operations. The records say his mission never happened, but..." He showed me a document, orders for experimental aircraft testing, signed by Colonel James Reyes. The fog that shouldn't have been there suddenly had an explanation that made everything worse. We weren't just investigating a ghost plane. We were investigating his family's buried secrets. Our communications specialist, Technical Sergeant Park, set up electronic surveillance around the bomber. What we captured that night changed everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. The aircraft's radio system was still active, impossible after 50 years in the jungle, but the dials glowed with soft amber light. Park plugged in his modern equipment and immediately picked up transmissions. Mayday, Mayday, Fox Squadron to base, Engine 2 is down. Repeat, Engine 2 is down. The voices were clear, desperate, and definitely from 1944. But then came something that made my blood freeze. Modern military terminology mixed with the period dialogue. HQ, do you copy? We're not alone out here, came through in a voice I recognized as my own from 2 days ago. The radio's picking up our conversations, Park whispered, but it's broadcasting them alongside the original 1944 transmissions. Reyes leaned closer to the equipment. The evil entity we'd sensed wasn't just haunting the crash site, it was collecting voices, storing them, mixing past and present into a supernatural radio show of military horror. Then we heard laughter, not the manic cackle of madness, but the genuine laughter of soldiers sharing a joke. It lasted 30 seconds before dissolving into screams. Jesus, they're still flying, Park said, monitoring the frequency readings. Whatever happened to them, they don't know they crashed. The possession of their final moments was playing on loop, broadcasting into eternity, and somehow our presence was feeding it new material. The jungle went silent as the transmission ended with words that would haunt my dreams. He's inside the plane with us. The vision hit me during my night watch. One moment I was monitoring our perimeter. The next, I was inside the cockpit of Fox Squadron, watching 1944 unfold through Lieutenant Reed's eyes. We were flying standard reconnaissance over the Pacific when the black clouds appeared. Not storm clouds, something else entirely. The compass began spinning wildly, and our radio filled with voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. Thompson, you seeing this? Reed called to his co-pilot, but Thompson was staring straight ahead, his face locked in an expression of pure terror. In the reflection of the cockpit glass, I could see why. Behind Reed sat a figure in military dress, but where his face should have been was empty space, not darkness, just absence. The paranormal encounter intensified as the plane entered the cloud. Time moved strangely. The altimeter showed we were climbing and descending simultaneously. The radio crackled with mission coordinates that led to impossible locations. Fox Squadron, you are ordered to investigate grid reference, reality, investigate the nature of time, in the combat zone of tomorrow. The orders made no sense, but Reed followed them. The evil entity in the cockpit wasn't giving commands. It was just watching, waiting, feeding on their confusion and growing terror. As the plane broke through the clouds, I saw what they saw. Not 1944 Philippines, but a landscape that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. Rice fields from 1993 overlapped with jungle from 1944, and somewhere in between, soldiers from different wars moved through the same space without seeing each other. The hallucination or reality question became irrelevant. This was beyond both. This was time itself breaking down. The experiment was called Operation Temporal, Reyes confessed, as we sat in his command tent. My father wasn't just stationed here, he was running it. The documents he'd been hiding told a story the Pentagon had buried deeper than any grave. In 1944, a joint U.S.-Filipino Special Forces unit had been testing experimental navigation equipment designed to confuse enemy radar by manipulating temporal signatures. They thought they could make aircraft invisible by moving them slightly out of sync with normal time, he continued, his voice hollow with inherited guilt. Reed's bomber was the test flight. I thought I was losing my mind processing the implications. War trauma was one thing, but war crimes against the laws of physics were another. The voices in my head weren't random. They were the crew of Fox Squadron, trapped in a temporal loop created by his father's experiments. The cursed land isn't cursed, Reyes said, showing me classified photos from 1944. It's wounded. Time bleeds here because we tore a hole in it. The supernatural force we'd been encountering wasn't malevolent. It was trying to heal itself, using the only materials available, the memories and voices of everyone who entered the affected zone. HQ ordered the experiment shut down after Reed's plane disappeared, he whispered, but they never figured out how to close what they'd opened. The fog that moved like it was alive suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't weather, it was time itself, visible and searching for a way to repair the damage. And now, 50 years later, it had found Reed's grandson to finish what was started. The classified files Reyes finally showed me contained horrors that made the paranormal encounters seem reasonable by comparison. Operation Temporal hadn't been about navigation. It had been about weaponizing time itself. Imagine being able to send an entire enemy division 5 minutes into the past, read one memo from 1944. They fire at positions we've already abandoned. They plan attacks against targets that no longer exist. The mission briefing I'd never seen laid out the truth. Reed's bomber had been deliberately sent into the temporal anomaly to test its effects on living subjects. The extraction point coordinates led not to safety, but to the heart of the experiment. Colonel James Reyes, Major Reyes's father, had signed the orders personally. But there was something else in the files, something that made my blood freeze. The experiment hadn't been shut down in 1944. It had been moved underground, classified at levels that didn't officially exist. And according to the final document, dated just 3 days ago, it was still active. They've been feeding it, Reyes said, his voice breaking. Every mysterious disappearance in this region, every aircraft that goes missing over the South China Sea, they've been feeding the anomaly to keep it stable. The evil entity wasn't just haunting one crash site, it was part of a system, a temporal prison that had been operating for decades under official sanction. The radio silence we've been maintaining, I realized with growing horror, it's not for operational security. It's so no one can call for help when the anomaly takes them. We weren't investigators. We were the next test subjects. The first sign something was wrong came at 3 a.m. Santos failed to report for his scheduled radio check. When we reached his guard position, we found his rifle propped against a tree, still warm, with his night vision goggles scanning an empty jungle. "Santos, report your position," I called into my radio, but only whispers in the static answered. By dawn, 3 more soldiers had vanished. Their gear remained exactly where they'd been stationed. Weapons, equipment, even their body heat signatures still visible on thermal imaging. But the men themselves were gone, as if they'd simply stepped out of reality. The paranormal encounter was escalating beyond anything I'd experienced in 10 years of combat zones. Park found their radios still active, broadcasting 1944 transmissions mixed with their own voices from the previous night. "Perimeter secure," came Santos's voice through the static. No movement detected, but Santos had been missing for 6 hours. Reyes studied the equipment with the grim recognition of someone who'd seen this before. "The temporal field is expanding," he said. It's not just showing us the past anymore, it's collecting the present. The psychological horror of losing my men to something I couldn't fight or understand was consuming me. This wasn't war. This was something worse. War had rules, enemies you could see, battles you could win or lose. This was just disappearance, one soldier at a time. "Sir, the fog is moving," reported our remaining communications specialist. The unnatural presence I'd felt since day one was becoming visible. Tendrils of mist that moved with purpose, reaching toward our remaining positions, like fingers searching for something specific. I heard my name whispered from inside the bomber, though I was standing 50 meters away. The voices in my head were no longer my imagination. They were invitations. "I've been lying to you," Reyes confessed as we watched the fog consume our base camp. "The diary pages I hid, they mentioned me by name." The supernatural force wasn't random. It had been waiting specifically for him to return, carrying the guilt that followed us home across generations. Reed's final diary entry, written in blood, contained a message for his grandson he'd never meet. "Carlos, if you're reading this, you know what your father did. The experiment didn't fail. It succeeded too well. We're not dead. We're not alive. We're just flying, waiting for someone to correct the mistake." The possession of inherited trauma was complete. Reyes wasn't investigating a paranormal encounter. He was fulfilling a family obligation that transcended death itself. The evil entity had been using his grandfather's memories to guide him here. "Every night for 20 years, I've dreamed of this place," he whispered. "I've seen the crash, felt the plane falling, heard my grandfather calling my name. I thought I was losing my mind, but it was him trying to tell me how to fix this." The cursed land hadn't just claimed his grandfather. It had been slowly claiming him his entire life. The war trauma he carried wasn't from his own service, but from a war that ended before he was born. "The temporal field isn't expanding randomly," he continued. "It's following bloodlines, collecting family members to complete some kind of circuit." I realized with growing horror what he was suggesting. The voices in my head weren't random either. They belonged to soldiers whose descendants were somewhere in the military database, waiting their turn to be called. The local shaman arrived at our decimated camp as if summoned by the chaos itself. Old Manuel Santos, Maria's husband and keeper of stories the military had never bothered to record, carried answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "The Burbalung," he said, studying the temporal distortions with eyes that had seen too much. "Not a creature, but a condition. Soldiers who die in war loops, their memories devoured until they forget they are dead." His explanation made the paranormal encounter suddenly comprehensible. The evil entity wasn't malevolent, it was confused, trapped in a cycle of military routine it couldn't break because it had forgotten how to stop following orders. "Your grandfather and his crew," Manuel told Reyes. "They're still trying to complete their mission. But the mission parameters keep changing as time flows around them." The supernatural force was following a logic we couldn't understand because it existed in multiple time frames simultaneously. What looked like haunting was actually military discipline carried beyond death. Soldiers still reporting for duty in a war that had ended before they realized they'd died. "To break the loop, someone must take command," Manuel explained. "Someone with the authority to give them new orders." The jungle went silent as his words sank in. Reyes understood first. He carried the same rank as his grandfather, held the same clearance level as his father. In the military hierarchy that transcended time and death, he was the only one who could relieve Fox Squadron of their eternal duty. But commanding dead soldiers meant joining them in their timeless combat zone. The storm that hit our position wasn't natural weather. It was time itself, swirling around the bomber as decades collapsed into moments. Reyes made his decision as lightning that couldn't exist illuminated aircraft that shouldn't be there. "I'm going in," he said, checking his sidearm out of habit rather than necessity. The cockpit door opened at his touch, and I watched him step into 1944. Inside, the bomber was fully operational, instruments glowing, engines humming, and crew members alive and desperately trying to understand their situation. "Lieutenant Reed," Reyes called to his grandfather. "Major Carlos Reyes, reporting for duty." Reed turned, and for the first time since the crash, recognition flickered in his eyes. But the other crew members saw something different. An enemy officer wearing an unfamiliar uniform, speaking with authority they didn't recognize. "He's the one who sent us here," shouted Thompson, reaching for his sidearm. The paranormal encounter became a battle between family obligation and military suspicion. Reed tried to explain to his crew that this stranger was his grandson, but the temporal field had damaged their ability to process new information. They existed in a loop where only their final mission mattered. "Fox Squadron, this is your new commanding officer," Reyes announced, using his inherited authority. "You are hereby relieved of current mission parameters." But the cockpit instruments began spinning wildly. The evil entity that had sustained the loop for 50 years wasn't ready to release its prisoners. Outside, I watched the bomber flicker between crashed wreckage and operational aircraft. The voices in my head screamed coordinates that led nowhere, mission objectives that couldn't be completed, and orders that made sense only to the dead. "To break the loop, I have to crash the plane myself," Reyes explained over the radio, his voice calm despite the impossibility of his situation. "I have to relive their final flight and make the choice my father never gave them." Inside the cockpit, past and present were negotiating the terms of reality. Reed understood what his grandson was offering, a chance to complete their mission properly with full knowledge of the consequences. "Carlos, if you do this, you'll be trapped here with us," Reed warned. "Time doesn't work the same way in this place." But Reyes had already made his decision. The guilt that followed us home across generations would end with him. He would finish what his father started and his grandfather had died trying to complete. The psychological horror of watching a living man choose to join the dead was consuming my ability to think rationally. This wasn't heroism. This was the final stage of inherited trauma, where the only escape was to complete the cycle. "Begin final approach," Reyes ordered, taking control of the aircraft. As the bomber began its descent toward the crash site, I realized the terrible truth. The extraction point coordinates in every mission briefing had been leading here, to this moment. Every soldier sent to investigate had been potential candidates for this role, but only someone with Reed's bloodline could take command of Fox Squadron. The unnatural presence I'd felt since day one wasn't hunting us, it was auditioning us. And Reyes had just accepted the starring role in a performance that would last forever. Through the radio, I heard him say the words that would haunt my dreams. "We never left 1944. The mission ended, but I still hear them marching." 25 years later, I'm watching the same coordinates through a drone camera from Kadena Air Base. Technology has advanced, but some mysteries only deepen with time. The rice field looks normal now. Locals farm it without incident. Children play where soldiers once disappeared. But sometimes, on certain nights when the fog moves like it's alive, my drone cameras pick up something impossible. A World War II bomber flying perfect formation over Mindanao. It appears for exactly 37 seconds, following flight patterns that match Reed's original mission parameters. The aircraft looks operational, with crew visible in the cockpit. Then it vanishes, leaving no trace on radar or infrared. The paranormal encounter never ended. It just learned to hide better. Tonight, as I monitor the feed, I see something that makes my blood freeze. In the cockpit of the ghost plane, a figure waves at my camera. Major Carlos Reyes, still flying his grandfather's mission, still trying to complete orders that led to this eternal loop. Behind me, someone clears their throat. I turn to find a man in a modern military uniform, but his face is empty space. Not darkness, just absence. On his collar, the insignia reads Observer. He's been watching the feeds with me, probably for years. Help me, help me. Echoes from my radio, the same message crews intercepted in 1993. The screen flashes, 1944, mission restarted. If you've heard stories like this or served near something you can't explain, let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more declassified nightmares.